I've made videos before about unfair dismissal cases and about the common, very, very common mistake that employers make, and that is that they look at the alleged wrongdoing and make a decision, perhaps to terminate the employee, terminate their employment, and that's the end of the matter. And they're satisfied that the employee was guilty of gross misconduct, and on that basis they justify the decision to terminate. But this is a flawed process. It's a flawed line of thinking, because every employee, no matter what they have done, no matter what the allegations, are entitled to natural justice and fair procedures. In this particular case, and again it's just another example of this, and there are countless examples of it, Dawn Meats terminated or sacked an employee. The employee was out sick at the time, but the employee worked, he was pictured working on the farm while sick. The employer obviously felt they were justified, that this was gross misconduct, justified in terminating. They engaged the services of a private detective to take pictures of him working after he was injured, and he was pictured working on his farm. Employer assumed or thought that they were justified. They went through some sort of a process, but quite frankly it didn't cut the mustard from the perspective of the WRC, and the WRC adjudicator held that the whole process was lacking in fair procedures and natural justice, thought that, or opined that the decision to terminate was disproportionate and that they should have considered an alternative short of dismissal. And just to summarise, the adjudicating officer, Enda Murphy, found that the employee, Mr. James, had not been properly informed of the nature of the allegations of gross misconduct against him when he was suspended in advance of the first disciplinary meeting. He said that Mr. James was confronted at the meeting with allegations about a pattern of absenteeism and that he had been working on his private farm while out sick. But the failure to provide advance details was in breach of Dawn Meats' own disciplinary policy, he wrote, adding that Mr. James was totally unaware of the precise nature of the allegations. The adjudicator also says that he had grave concerns in relation to the manner in which the allegations of gross misconduct were presented to the employee at the investigation and disciplinary hearings. It's clear that there was a lack of clarity throughout this process in relation to the precise nature and extent of the charges that were being pursued against him. The adjudicator also found that there were procedural shortcomings and irregularities in the investigation and disciplinary process. This raised doubts about the impartiality and independence of the process, and consequently the fairness of the process, the adjudicator wrote. And the adjudicator also said that Dawn Meats did not consider or make allowances for any mitigating factors put forward by the complainant or alternatives to dismissal. There was no dispute that Mr. James had carried out tasks on his farm, Mr. Murphy wrote, but Dawn Meats had scant regard for their former employees' explanations. He found dismissing Mr. James was disproportionate and did not fall within the range of reasonable responses open to the company, and therefore both substantively and procedurally unfair. The adjudicator awarded $10,000 to the complainant for the unfair dismissal and a further $2,500, 6 weeks' pay for failing to provide statutory notice entitlements under the Minimum Notice in Terms of Employment Act. You might, at first reading of this case or coming across it, you might say, what was the employer supposed to do? Here's a man who's out sick, and now we discover that he's working on the farm and he's selling hay to us, the employer. They engaged the services of a private detective. They carried out covert surveillance. They took plenty of photographs of the employee working and so on. But the fundamental conclusion, the fundamental thing that you must take from this is that every employee is entitled to fair procedures and natural justice. Why? Because it's a constitutional right. The employer must go through a procedure, a process that's fair, and that's not just a box ticking exercise. but that is fundamentally fair and gives the employee fair procedures, natural justice, a fair say, and deal with him fairly. That, according to the WRC, is not what happened in this case. And even though on the face of it and looking at the headline, you might say that Don Meats, the employer, was perfectly entitled to dismiss this man, the fact of the matter is the adjudicator at the WRC held against the company, and the employee succeeded and has been awarded over 12 grand for unfair dismissal and minimum notice. Again, time after time, I can get you countless examples of cases like this where the employer may appear to have been justified in doing what they did, but they failed to follow procedure. And if you don't follow procedure as an employer, you're certainly leaving yourself open to a claim against you for unfair dismissal, which has a very good prospect of success. Hope you find this video useful. If you do, I would appreciate if you give it the thumbs up down below, and you may be interested in subscribing to my YouTube channel. If you are, just hit the bell icon and hit the subscribe button down below. Thanks a lot.